And I think it's actually the time that we can actually start a bit, okay? So good morning, all attendants, okay? Dean, okay, chairpersons, faculty members, okay, and also our graduate students, okay? I'm actually on behalf of the Martin II School of Management and Economics, and in collaboration with Graduate School of eLearning, okay? We have an honor and pleasure to have with us today a very special guest speaker, the Director of Global Indicators Group from World Bank, okay? He will actually come to lecture for us on the topic, New Hopes for a Changing World, okay? Over here we have Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, okay, a good friend of our, one of our lecturer here in the Graduate School of eLearning, Dr. Firuz Anaraki, okay. And then for Dr. Claros, let me just introduce him a bit so you get to know him, okay. He's actually responsible for doing the business, doing business report, okay, if you have heard about that, from the World Bank, okay, and other international benchmarking studies of the World Bank Group. He was also the chief economist and director of global competitiveness program at World Economic Forum, editor for Global Competitiveness Report. Before joining the case of the Economic Forum, he worked for several years in the financial sector in London and with a special focus on emerging markets. He's also one of the IMF resident representative in Russian Federation during the 1990s as well, okay? And for his background, okay, Dr. Claros was actually educated in England and US, receiving the case of his diploma in mathematical statistics from Cambridge University, a PhD in economics from Duke University, and was actually a professor, okay, of economics at University of Chile in Santiago. His more recent works, okay, include the case of the Innovation for Development reports, okay, in 2009 to 2010, Strengthening Innovation for Prosperity of Nations in 2009, okay, Fiscal Challenges After Global Financial Crisis, a survey of economic issues in 2014, and his latest one is actually on removing impediments to sustainable economic development, the case of corruption, okay, which is actually from last year, 2015. Okay, so over here, let's actually welcome the case of Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros. Okay. Okay. Now, I'm sorry, okay, let me just have a short, a little bit more introduction over here in that. Just for the time being, because our dean, okay, today is actually presented by our School of Management. Our dean will actually come for a short time, and then she will have to leave for a small meeting afterward around 10:30, so she'll be staying with only the beginning. So I just hope that we can have a short picture together first, okay? So can I have all attendants to come forward and take a group picture together with our special guest speaker? Okay, please. Okay, Doctor.โอเคค่ะเดี๋ยวดินตรงกลางก็ได้ค่ะอาจารย์ตรงกลางนี้โอเคนะคะ So I hope that you're already very excited to actually hear Dr. Claros for the case of today's topic. Okay, so I'm going to give the whole stage to our guest speaker. Please welcome Dr. Claros.
Do I need a microphone? You think? Yeah. Is this better? Yeah? Okay. All right. Good. I thought that I would stand here instead of there because I'm a little bit closer to you. And in fact, if some of the people in the back want to sit here in the first row, that's you're most welcome. We have 3 chairs here in the first row. You're going to be a bit closer if you want. Yes, come. Good. Anybody else? Anybody else would like to come and sit in the front? Thank you. Come forward. Here, you can sit here. Okay, good. Thank you. What I'd like to do today, to begin with, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the forces or some of the factors that are kind of shaping the world in which we live in, and that are going to have a great influence on the kind of world that we will have in the future. And I would like to begin with something that everybody talks about, but we don't always examine the ramifications associated with population growth. And then I also want to say a few words about changes in the global economy that are going to also have an impact in the kind of world that is emerging in coming decades. You know that the world's population for the first time reached 1 billion people in the year 1800. If you have seen a graph of global population over the last couple of thousand years, it grows, sort of rises very, very gradually, very, very slowly, and it crosses the 1 billion mark in the year 1800, about 200 and plus years ago. And then from 1800 on, because of improvements in public health, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of scientific progress and technology, average life expectancy begins to rise, and then very quickly population growth begins to pick up, right? And so a graph of population growth, from let's say the time of Jesus to the present, looks like this, right? And around the 19th century, it sort of takes a sharp, slope upwards. And therefore, by the year 1990, there are 5 billion of us. By the year 2003, there are 6 billion of us. And today, the world's population is roughly about 7.5 billion people. And most projections are that by 2050, there will be 8 to 9 billion people, depending on the kind of assumptions that you make. Right? Now, what are the implications? Furthermore, 95% of the increase in population, let's say from the 5 billion or let's say the 6 billion in 2003, to the 8 billion by 2030, 95% of this increase is going to be in the developing countries. The population is not growing in Spain and in Italy and Japan. It is growing in Brazil and in Nigeria and in Iran and I presume in Thailand and in other countries in the emerging market world. And furthermore, the overwhelming majority of the population growth is in the cities. It's people moving from the countryside into the cities, and the world is becoming, much more urban. Now, what are the implications of this growth in the population? Well, there are many. Of course, one of them is that there will be more demand for energy. Energy consumption is going to double over the next 30 years. This is going to have, very, very dramatic implications for energy demand, and we need this, because we need to keep these people warm in the winter time, because we need to illuminate the houses where they will be living, because we need to grow food and manufacture, process food to feed these people, and so on. Right? So huge increases in energy demand. And of course, there will be demand for other things as well. Demand for housing, demand for fresh water, demand for food, demand for waste management. I remember some 10 years ago, I was in China, in Shanghai, at a dinner, And the mayor of Shanghai was sitting next to me, and he was talking to me about some of the challenges of managing a huge metropolis whose population was expected to be, 20 million people by 2020 or so. And, how do you manage waste? How do you manage waste disposal in a city that has 20 million people? I was about to say, how do you manage traffic in a city that has 20 million people? But I don't need to say that because you already know, living in Bangkok, that traffic is a huge problem, right? Last night with my colleague Edward, we were debating what time should he come to pick me up at the hotel. We wanted to be here by 9 o'clock, so should it be 7:30? Should it be 8 o'clock? In the end, we decided to be conservative, and he came to pick me up at 7 o'clock because I wanted to avoid the embarrassment of being late to my own presentation, which you usually don't want to do, right? So 2 hours, to cross, I guess, a few kilometers in Bangkok. So that's one of the problems of population growth. In China, the urban population was about 190 million people in the year 1980. It was 420 million people in the year 2000, and most forecasts are that by 2030 there will be 1 billion people in China living in the cities, right? And what does this mean? It means basically 1 billion people that want to have a higher standard of living, 1 billion people that have this expectation that their income should be rising in real terms every year. 1 billion people who think that they have a right to have 2 cars and they're parked by the home where they live. And of course, you can probably already guess that it's going to be very difficult, to have those levels of consumption. And also, I will say a little more about this. But these people, and not just in China, but in the developing world, they have sort of expectations of improvements in living standards. And all of this is, of course, going to put a lot of pressure on the world's resources. Not just water and land, but raw materials and other inputs that we use to build houses, to feed people, to pave highways, to light up streets, and to manage traffic and so on. Let me make a few little footnotes to these forecasts. Richard Cooper is a professor at Harvard University, a very distinguished international economist and a good friend. And a few years ago, talking about the impact of population growth, he was saying that these forecasts for the growth of population over the next 20, 30 years are actually subject to very narrow margins of uncertainty. He said that these extra 2 billion people by 2020 will actually happen because the mothers that will have these children are already with us. They have already been born. And therefore, unless you anticipate some kind of global catastrophe, something that some pandemic or some shock to the Earth's system that is totally unexpected, this population growth will happen. It will take place, and so we better begin to think about how we're going to be dealing with the ramifications and the implications of this. A second footnote is that the population growth, as I indicated, is very uneven. There are regions of the world which are going to see dramatic increases in the number of people living there, and then there are countries that are basically, seeing a reduction in population. I don't know whether you have seen, but it was indicated when I was introduced that I spent some time in Moscow in Russia in the 1990s. When I arrived to Russia in 1992, the country's population was just a little bit below 150 million people. Today it is 144 million people, so 6 million Russians have disappeared. And it is expected that by the end of this century, Russia's population on present trends is going to be probably around 100 million people, right? So shrinking. And same thing is happening in Japan, in Italy, in Spain, and a few other countries where fertility rates are very, very low. And you might say, well, what's the problem? Well, there are problems. There are problems, or at least challenges, because essentially, let's look at Italy. In Italy, with an aging population, you have more and more people joining the ranks of the pensioners, the retirees. And who's going to pay their pensions? It is going to be the people who are working, right? Because that's the system that we have. That if you're young, you work, you contribute to a pension system, and that money is actually used to pay the pensions of the people who are retiring while you're still working. The problem with that, with aging populations, is that the proportion of people who are retired in relation to the whole size of the population rises over time. And that puts a lot of pressure on pension systems. And it begins to raise questions about the ability of governments to fulfill their obligations on health, on pensions, on other kinds of social spending that governments typically do for people who have retired. And so this is a very, very serious problem. Many countries, I won't give names, many countries are in fact bankrupt. Within 15, 20, 25 years, they are not going to be able to fulfill their commitments for pension payments, health expenditures, and so on, as long as we have aging population. So it's a serious problem, right? What do we do with this problem, by the way? Well, one possibility is that you raise the retirement age, right? In some countries, let's say in Europe, in Italy, the retirement age, I think, is 65 years old, right? So at age 65, you begin to receive your pensions from the contributions that you have made to the system. However, if you allow people to work longer, because people are healthier, then that relieves a little bit the pressure on pension systems. So some people are saying, well, maybe in the future we're going to have a kind of a new system, a new social contract, whereby the government is going to say, you're going to work until you're 80 years old, and then we're going to give you pension for about 6 months, and then you will die because we don't have enough money to pay you pensions for the next 20 years, right? Whereas today, if you retire at 65, and average life expectancy in your country is 80, that means that for 15 years, you get support from the government. Well, many governments are not going to be able to afford to do that, right? So it's an interesting question there. But, raising the retirement age, maybe not to 80, but to higher ages, in Germany already it's been raised to 67, is not a bad thing, because if health improves, if we are making improvements in expanding life expectancy because of improvements in technology and health and medicine and so on, then maybe it's okay for people to work longer, right? Why should they retire when they are 65 and when they are still, very productive and so on? That population growth will have particularly serious challenges for countries in the Arab world. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa region have some of the highest rates of population growth in the world. And just to give you an example, in the Arab countries, you need to create something like 100 million jobs in the next 20 years to keep the unemployment rates at current levels. And those unemployment rates are already the highest in the world. So they have a serious, serious problem there. They have to have economies that create jobs for the younger people who are coming into the labor force. And if they don't succeed in doing this, then you can expect a lot of political instability in the Middle East countries, which of course we have already seen in the last decade or in the last 2 decades. So that's a potential problem. And that is very much linked to population growth and to the inability of many of these governments to reform their economies, to make them, job-creating machines. Okay, now let me say a little bit about changes in the global economy, and then I will try to bring together the two, the population growth on the one hand and changes in the global economy on the other, and speculate with you a little bit about the future. I guess in terms of changes in the global economy, what's happening is that we are seeing sort of huge transformations as a result of what we call globalization. And one important element of that, of course, is what's happening on the technology and the communication side. The cost of communication is dropping very, very quickly. What was the cost of a 3-minute telephone call between New York and London in 1930? In today's dollars? $300. $300. If you made a 3-minute telephone call from New York to London in 1930, in today's dollars it was $300, right? So not many people called on the telephone from New York to London. You really had to have very powerful reasons. You had to be a big business. You had to be a government official, making some important business over the telephone. Of course, today with Skype and with other technologies, the cost of communication has essentially dropped to zero, for a telephone. And of course, the implications of the drastic reduction in the cost of communication means that many business functions can be shifted, to other parts of the world. I have a brother in the United States who's a doctor, and he has to keep medical records for the appointments that he has and the patients that he sees. He records these data. After he sees a patient, he goes to a dictaphone and he records, the basic data, and then this file is then sent via email to India, where then a transcript is produced for his own records. And so you see more and more companies, shifting backroom operations, as they are called, to other parts of the world. In Switzerland, the Swiss airline, for already many years, does all the accounting, in India. It used to be done in Switzerland with Swiss accountants, but that turned out to be quite expensive, so it can be done much more cheaply in India. And so you see this kind of changes. Of course, globalization and changes, drops in communication and so on, is leading to a kind of a very global perspective on the part of companies. Companies are framing their decisions and their strategies, for markets, for sources of supply, for output, where they sell their products already in a global perspective, and more they're also doing it in terms of the location of production and in terms of the use of the labor force. Global companies today, have a very diverse labor force, and they're operating in what is essentially a kind of an integrated global economy. Transportation costs have also come down very sharply, just like communication. And this basically means that it is a lot easier for companies who are established in a country to, pack and move somewhere else. So that there's much greater mobility, and therefore this means that the kind of environment that you create in your country for the business community, including foreign investors, is tremendously important. If you create an environment that is friendly, where the regulation is sensible, where your labor force is, relatively skilled, where there is political stability, you're going to derive many, many benefits. And if you don't have one of these elements, if you don't have political stability, if you don't have sensible regulation, companies are basically going to leave your country and they're going to go and settle themselves somewhere else in the world, because now moving, dismantling your factory and building it again somewhere else in the world is not as expensive as it used to be. Also, what we see is more and more the role of alliances. A company in Singapore uses capital from Taiwan to produce telephones for the U.S. market using an Israeli technology license, right? So you have here, many countries coming together, essentially to produce telephones for the U.S. market, but alliances are more and more important. And so now, what are the ramifications or the implications of bringing these two forces or sets of forces together. You know, on the one hand, we have population growth, which I have already explained. On the one hand, on the other hand, we have these changes in the global economy. And so the question is, you know, how do these things interact, and what do they mean for the future? Right? Well, one of the things that is happening is that, of course, we have a very unprecedented rise in complexity in economic, social, political, and environmental systems. We have institutions which are struggling to rise to the challenge of rapid change in the world and the emergence of a much more complex kind of infrastructure on the economic side, on the social side, on the political side, on the environmental side. And I think that these kinds of increases in complexity are leading to vulnerabilities in the kind of world that is surrounding us and the kind of world that is emerging. Let me give you a few examples. Right? One of the big concerns that we have today has to do with the whole question of climate change. That, you know, our scientists are beginning to warn us and have already been doing it for many years, and basically saying, look, there is a huge problem here. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been burning fossil fuels. We have been releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The planet's temperature is rising. This is already beginning to have all kinds of implications on the physical planet, right? The ice sheet in Antarctica and in the Arctic is melting. Greenland is losing ice at a speed that is just incredible. I mean, if you look at how much ice has been melted, you know, in, let's say, 1990, 95, 2000, 2005, every 5-year intervals, you know, and the volume is actually rising at an accelerating pace. All right? And this is very, very concerning. Right? In December of last year, 175 governments came together to sign an accord on climate change, where they made some pledges to reduce emissions. And yet the scientists, although they celebrated this meeting because it signaled, you know, a high level of cooperation between most countries in the world, the scientists already have said that these voluntary pledges that have been made are, even if they are fully implemented, which is a big if, are not going to be sufficient to prevent temperatures from rising more than 3 degrees centigrade, which is, you know, a kind of a critical threshold. We have never seen in the last 1 million years an increase in temperatures of more than 3 degrees centigrade. And if it happens in the next few decades, you know, it will have all kinds of, you know, very, very destabilizing consequences for the planet. All right, so this is a very good example of how, as the world has become more complex, this has put pressure on human institutions. In the case of climate change, we don't even have a human institution like the United Nations, like the International Monetary Fund, or some other, you know, World Trade Organization to address this particular problem. All right? The nation state is of course in crisis. The nation state is essentially a territorial concept, right? Which is defined by a geographical border. We know what is France. We know what is Argentina. We know what is Peru. We can look it up in a map, and there are borders that actually define these names for us. So it's, you know, very much a kind of a physical, territorial concept, you know. But the problem, of course, is that now the economic system that we have goes beyond national boundaries, and governments are having difficulties, you know, while having national jurisdiction, because that is the system that we have. We have a system of sovereign states, right? So a government has jurisdiction over its national territory. Right? Governments are struggling, basically operating in a context of a system where the global economy has become, of course, you know, completely integrated and universal. And so governments are being forced to give up sovereignty in areas, in response to the forces of integration. And in some cases, they are doing it reasonably successfully, like, for instance, regulation of international trade, which is done at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. But in other areas, it's not being done at all. And climate change is, I guess, the best example of it, where we have a problem. It's a serious problem. It brings very serious risks for the future of the planet, but we don't have an organization that actually has jurisdiction over this particular problem, right? And so what we have is a little bit of ad hocery. We have governments coming together and collaborating in a kind of a voluntary way, with pledges, but nothing binding, nothing that will actually ensure that we solve a particular problem, all right? Now,